In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to make materials customizable in the editor. Alright, so with the material that we have created, this material will only be the way that we set it up here in the editor. And so if we apply this to multiple objects in our scene, it's going to apply it just as we see it here in our preview. And if we apply this to several objects in the scene and we decide that one of those needs to be changed a little bit, let's say that the tiling on our mask for our paint needs to be changed a little bit, we would have to come into the material and then change the tiling through our text coord, just like we did in the last lesson. But if we do that, it's going to change that on all of the objects that have this material applied, and we may not want that. And so a way to make materials flexible is to use parameters. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can use parameters to do that. So one way that I want to make this material flexible is to be able to change the tiling of the paint. And so you can see that text coord controls the tiling. Let's go ahead and right-click to bring up our menu, and we're going to go to our parameters. Now under parameters, you'll see things like texture 2D sampler, okay? But I don't see anything about coordinates. And so there's really not anything that I can do to make that a public parameter to where we can change that in an instanced material. Now we'll talk about instance materials here in just a little while. So how can I change this? Well, looking at my parameters, I have a couple of parameters that I could use. I have the scalar parameter, which will give me something that looks like that constant material, or that constant node, where it just gives me a number. And I can make that public and I can change that. We have the vector parameter, where we can change the color of something and make that public to where it can be changed in the editor. So right now, let's go ahead and bring in that scalar parameter. Notice how it has this green heading at the top. That's letting us know that that can be edited inside of the editor. Okay, so we can create what's called an instanced material. So what we have, or what we've created so far, is what we would consider the master material. This is what drives everything, but then we're going to add these parameters that will allow us to change specific things about the material. So in this case, I want to change things like the tiling. So how do I go about doing this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a multiply in between the texture coordinate and these two texture samples. And the multiply will give me access to changing its value by using this here. So I'll show you how that's done. Let me go ahead and pull this back a little bit, give myself some room. And let's hold down M and then left click, and that's going to bring up our multiply node. You could also right click and find that under your math parameter or category, and you'll find multiply here as well. Alright, so with that, let's plug in our text coord to A. And then I'm going to plug in this parameter into B. Now, with this parameter selected, we need to give it a name. So let's go ahead and call this tiling. Well, we'll just call it tiling. Okay, that should be fine. Notice its default value is set to 0. Let's go ahead and set its default value to 1. Okay, because whenever we have a texture, its tiling value on its X and its Y is usually set to 1.0 and 1.0. Now let's go ahead and change our text coord. Notice that we've set this to 2. Let's go ahead and set it to 1, because we're no longer allowing this to control our tiling. We're going to allow this to control it. Now, when the multiply, you're going to notice that we have the constant A and the constant B. A is set to 0 and B is set to 0. We want both of those set to 1. Okay? So we want it to tile evenly, okay, across the X and the Y. So now what I can do is I can go ahead and plug in my multiply here into the texture sample for the paint, and then I can also plug that in here in our normal map. Now notice what's happened to our texture. It's switched back to that 1 by 1 look. So now what I can do is I can go to this tiling parameter, and I could just simply change its value to 2, And notice how it's tiled that in both directions evenly. Perfect. Let's go ahead and set its default value back to 1 because we'll allow the designer to change that inside of the editor later. Now I'll show you how to create an instance material and we'll really see that in action in a moment. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the paint. I want to be able to change this paint color. Okay, so I can do this very easily. Let's simply right click and let's go to our parameters. And here we have the vector parameter. Left click on that and notice how it looks very similar to what we had before. I can double click on that and that'll bring up my color picker. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and click on my eyedropper and then left click on this color and that should input that. Now for some reason it's not bringing that in. It acted as if I clicked away from that. So we'll have to try and get as close as we possibly can. Okay, because I want that to be roughly my default value. We could also type in these values here, but I think we're pretty close. Let's go ahead and delete this off, and then let's plug this into B. And there we go. Now we need to give this a name. Let's call this paint underscore color. There we go. And that's going to be its default value. Perfect. So now what we can do is we can change that color inside of the editor. Now looking at this, I don't really think there's anything else that I want to change. We've got our tiling set. We really don't need to change our normal map. So everything's looking pretty good. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and save this material. To do that, we'll simply click Apply, and then in our content browser, if we take a look at this, if we go to our DT Materials folder, you'll see it right there. Now you'll need to remember to save, so we can also click right here on Saved All Modify Assets, Save Selected, and there we go. Now we can go ahead and we can make instance materials of this, and we can change those parameters that we've exposed. And we're going to talk about how to do that in our next lesson.